I begin this video with an acknowledgement that in the year 2020, the concept of political science seems like a joke. Right? My major in university was political science. What is political science? What would it even mean to think scientifically about politics or to have expertise in the science of politics? It seems like a bad joke. But there's a meaningful challenge for us to set aside the baggage of the particular culture we were born into, to set aside the assumptions built into the particular language we grew up speaking, and to examine politics scientifically. Most of you watching this video will assume that Bernie Sanders is left-wing, that all of his policies are left-wing, domestic, foreign policy, economic, social. You'll assume they're all left-wing just because Bernie Sanders says that he wants to help the poor. Do you think by definition, conservatives don't want to help the poor? Or do you think that's just a cultural assumption that's common in the United States of America right now in the year 2020? Do you think in Italy there are no conservatives who go out and help the poor hands-on? Conservative Christian Italians whose whole lives have to do with charity work, helping the homeless, helping drug addicts, helping orphans? No? I used to live in Cambodia. There were conservative Christians in Cambodia who were really helping the poor hands-on. They were doing that charity work there. I don't like those people, all right? There are conservatives who are devoted to helping the poor. There are conservatives who help the poor in charity work. There are conservatives who are committed to social and political policies that help the poor. And there will be in future, in Italy, in Cambodia, in the United States of America, there will be conservative Christians who build their whole political program on helping the poor. Because there is nothing ineluctable, there's nothing definitional about the connection between conservatism and, shall we say, contempt for the poor or indifference for the poor. That's just the cultural context of the United States of America right now in the year 2020. Right? How about Bernie Sanders in his policy on Detroit? And if you don't know what I mean, you didn't read the book. You did not read Bernie Sanders' book, which mentions Detroit again and again and again. Detroit is the locus classicus for the economic vision of Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is deeply committed to reviving automotive manufacturing in Detroit, heavy industry in Detroit. You know what I say? If Bernie Sanders wants to revive automotive manufacturing in Detroit, if he wants the economy of Detroit to go back to being the way it was in 1965, he doesn't need to be elected president of the United States. He needs to invent the time machine. All right? It's completely ridiculous. But tell me something. Can't you even imagine, if you just use your imagination a little bit, can't you imagine a conservative political leader saying exactly the same things that Bernie Sanders says about the economy of Detroit? Can't you imagine a conservative or even someone right-wing saying that the problem is losing all of our jobs to China and Japan? Bernie Sanders says that. Read his book. The problem is American jobs going away to China, Japan, and Mexico. The problem is that you need a government focused on reviving the car industry, heavy industry, and manufacturing in Detroit. Right? If you just go through economically what his problem is, this is like the slogan, "Make America Great Again." This is a fundamentally conservative, backward-looking view of the economy. And what he promises on this basis is more good-paying jobs, more high-paying jobs. And he thinks he's going to do that through heavy industry, mass manufacturing, and unions. Going back to the way things were in the 1960s, when you had, many thousands of people all working in the same factory on the same schedule on the same shift, and they could organize into a union and bargain for higher wages. Again, you need a time machine. This is not the reality of the economy in 2020, and looking ahead to 2030 and 2040, this is less and less the economic reality of life in America. But Bernie Sanders is fundamentally a conservative political thinker. He is looking back. He's looking back to the past, to the way things were in the United States of America, and he wants to go back there. Okay? And he looks to what are simply conservative examples of Western European states and what they've accomplished, and he conservatively wants America to go back to that standard also. Right? And look, I sympathize. Bernie Sanders goes to Denmark and he goes to Scotland and he looks at the social programs those countries have and he says America can do this too. There's nothing radical about that. Bernie Sanders himself says it. He says he's not a radical. It's actually a very conservative, very backward-looking way of thinking. What is Bernie Sanders' policy on education? He wants to keep the university system in the United States of America the same way it is now. He wants the same broken, bad system. He just wants to lower the price of entry. He just wants to remove the cost of tuition. What does Bernie Sanders want to do with medical care? He wants the same system the way it is now. He's just going to expand the government payment program. He's going to make it free, or he's going to make it incredibly cheap for people to get medical care with the same system. Right? This is not even reform. This is a conservative position on each of these policies. Instead of doing what the left wing definitionally does, instead of doing what the left has meant since the French Revolution when it was defined. All right? In your culture today, in the United States of America, you assume that anyone supporting limited government, small government, efficient government is conservative and right-wing, whereas anyone promoting the expansion of government programs, anyone who says government should become larger, should take on more responsibilities, more spending, that those people are left-wing. Neither one of these things is definitionally left or right. Okay? Historically, the people who were advocating for small government were the original liberals, the original philosophic radicals, the original utilitarians also. People who said, no, they don't want government bureaucracy expanding to control everything. They don't want totalitarian government. They want a sphere for personal liberty, which meant in practice, in large part, so-called free enterprise. That was a left-wing position, okay? And it could be again. And whether or not it is now in your culture, in your language, right? But definitionally, what happened with the French Revolution was you had a movement that said, hey, we can sweep aside the accumulated assumptions of centuries. We can get rid of tradition. We can start with a blank chalkboard, and we can figure out how to solve this problem. This problem, that problem, the other problem. We can say, look, the fact that 1,000 years ago, people started using a measurement called the foot that was allegedly the size of the king's foot, doesn't matter. What we need right now is a set of scientists to sit down with a blank chalkboard and design how we should measure things, weight, distance, time. We need a whole new system, starting from a blank sheet of paper. And you know what? The French Revolution ended in disaster. The French Revolution ended in failure. But it was during the French Revolution, it was the political discourse within the French Revolution that defined for us the meaning of the term left and left-wing in contrast to right that we still have today. And what America really needs is not the conservatism of Bernie Sanders. What America needs is someone who can look at the university system and say, this is broken and bad and wrong. And the way to fix it is not just keeping everything the same, but lowering the price of admission. Someone who can look at the hospital system and say, this is broken and bad and wrong. And the way to fix it is not just lowering the price of treatment, lowering the price of admission to the hospital, however you want to put it. Let me ask you something as a thought experiment real quickly here. Have you ever seen someone wearing a t-shirt that says the name of the driving school where they learn to drive a car? Have you ever seen someone with a baseball cap or other branded merchandise? The school where you learn to drive a car, if you learn to drive, the school where you learn to drive a car, did it have a football team? Did you guys get together and cheer for a multi-million-dollar football team? Did it have a swimming pool? Did it have huge palatial gardens? Why is there such a stark difference between the very efficient, very cheap world of people preparing to learn how to drive a car, preparing for a government exam that proves either you can or cannot drive a car safely, that gives you the credential, says, yes, you've learned how to drive. Why is there such a tremendous gap between that form of education and the multi-billion-dollar super corrupt industry of university education. A university education system that never was designed by anyone for any reason, where at best we can go back about 200 years and say this was a system of education for the edification of a tiny number of aristocratic men. Yes, men, there was only one gender. Men whose lives would be defined on the one hand by agriculture as landowning aristocrats, on the other hand by military service, and they needed a place to go and study Latin and Greek and ethics. You should take a look at what ethics meant about 150 years ago in academia. Get this education. So they could be refined gentlemen. And that's how we got this idea that everything, no matter what the subject, should take 4 years. How long does it take to become a bachelor of English? And let's be clear, unlike your driving test, there is no standard for what it means to be a bachelor. The government just never bothered to define that. They defined very precisely what defines who's a good driver and who's a bad driver, who's safe to drive a car. And the government defined that, right? There are a lot of other technical areas of expertise where the government has a definition, whether or not it's safe for you to own a gun, whether or not it's safe for you to operate a crane. Okay, there are things where there's a government-created exam. What does it mean to be a bachelor of English? Why does it take 4 years? Why can't you have some kind of competitive, lean, efficient business that sells you an education in English literature the same way there are small companies that'll sell you an education in how to drive a car? Why is that? Why does it have to take 4 years? Why do I have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to support a sports team and a swimming pool and palatial gardens and this whole permanent vacation lifestyle for thousands of students living on a campus just to become a Bachelor of English? And why does it take 4 years to become a Bachelor of English, while at the same time, it supposedly takes me only 4 years to learn Chinese? There is absolutely no way you could learn the Chinese language in 4 years. I'm in a position to speak on that. There is no way you could learn Russian in 4 years. And I've met and spoken to people who got a bachelor's degree in Russian. I've met people who got a bachelor's degree in Sanskrit. But the system itself is like way beyond the concept of a man who holds a hammer, sees every problem as a nail. The system is designed where they started with a format, a completely irrational medieval format that's just an echo of a tradition from centuries ago having to do with aristocratic gentlemen's education. There's no applicability in the real world today. It wasn't even designed to prepare you to be a Bachelor of English, let alone competent in Chinese, let alone competent in mechanical engineering or any other subject. We started with a completely cultural, traditional concept of what higher education was supposed to be, built around Greek and Latin and ethics, and then we just said, okay, we'll sell it to you in a whole bunch of flavors. But whether you choose to study Chinese or you choose to study English literature, it's going to be 4 years. It's going to cost you the same amount of money. It's going to take the same amount of time. And if you choose something that's easy to learn, we're going to load on a whole bunch of breadth requirements, a whole bunch of irrelevant courses that you have to take just to make it fill up 4 years. And you know what? If you choose something that's really challenging, that's basically impossible to learn in 4 years, then we're going to load it up with breadth requirements and pretend that was never the point to begin with. We're going to pretend that we're really teaching you critical thinking. So the fact that you spent $50,000 and lost 4 years of your life and you still can't speak Chinese, or you still can't read a newspaper in Russian, that doesn't really matter because you got critical thinking. Thanks for your $50,000. Here's your worthless diploma. Bernie Sanders wants to revive the economy in Detroit by traveling back to 1965. And that's exactly what he wants to do for universities also. In 1965, university tuition was cheap. A tiny percentage of the population got a university degree, and the economic value of the university degree was much higher than it was today. A BA, a bachelor's degree in 1965, actually led to job opportunities. Today, it leads to zero. Bernie Sanders is not looking at the reality of coding camps, of how people now get an education and training to be able to really do computer science. Let me tell you something. Coding camps, if you want to learn how to program a computer, there's no swimming pool. There's no sports team. Okay? There are no gardens. It's a lot more like going to driving school. And it's still expensive. But what you're paying for, all the money is going into giving you job training for the specific skill you need to learn. You're not getting breadth requirements with English literature. You're not getting irrelevant teaching. Hey, that could be a better way to organize adult education in Chinese, in baking. Reminder, guys, I went to college to learn how to bake bread. Didn't learn a goddamn thing. That's another. I've been back into formal education many times. Bernie Sanders is not looking around analytically and saying, what we have here is the accumulation of a set of irrational traditions since the Dark Ages. And what we need to do is start thinking more like the left wing did in the French Revolution and wipe the board clean and start thinking rationally, reasoning from first principles to conclusions. How do we solve this problem? How do we provide education to millions of people, to everybody, or to 90% of people? Not take a system of education that was designed for a tiny minority of the population 150 years ago. Not try to go back to the system of education as it was in 1965. Not try to just take a completely broken system that's bankrupting the nation and just lower the price to entry. Just socialize the cost of that education. Why can't we start from a blank chalkboard, from a blank sheet of paper, and think, how can we provide education to the poor? How can we provide education to everybody at a high level of quality that leads to a high level of employability at a low cost or an effective cost? How are we going to solve that problem? If you started with a blank chalkboard, nobody would come to the conclusion that we should imitate what's happening right now at Oxford University, England, at Cambridge University, England. Nobody would say, well, the first thing we got to do is build a cathedral. Nobody would say the first thing we got to do is build an enormous sports stadium and start spending millions of dollars on football. We have the accretion of cultural assumptions, the accretion of cultural expectations. And those of us who are really willing to think pragmatically and nihilistically in overturning those cultural assumptions, those are the people who are truly and profoundly left-wing. What Bernie Sanders wants to do is truly and profoundly conservative. He wants Detroit to go back to the way it was in 1965. He wants the university system to go back to the way it was in 1965. And he looks at the accomplishment of Western European countries, whether it be Scotland or it be Denmark, and he wants America to emulate what those conservative government institutions have already achieved, rather than really thinking through what's optimal, what's most effective, not what are the greatest hits of the last 50 years of political and economic development, but what could be the best solution to these problems for the next 50 years. That's what's really left-wing. That's what's really radical.